What if the price of genius wasn't success but silence? Not applause, but a lifetime of voices that never stopped screaming inside your head. Imagine this. A man who changed the sound of America, who gave us sun-drenched harmonies, California dreams, and timeless hisses, standing on stage again after years of absence. The crowd erupts in celebration, but as he shuffles into view, something feels off. His face is vacant. His eyes don't search for connection. He doesn't seem to hear the music that made him famous. And then it hits the crowd all at once. This isn't a triumphant return. This is a ghost appearing at his own funeral. This isn't fiction. This is Brian Wilson, co-founder of the Beach Boys, one of the greatest musical minds America ever produced. And this is the tragic reality behind the sunshine. Welcome back to the channel, where we don't just tell stories or question what they mean. If you're tired of polished PR narratives and want to dive into the raw, uncomfortable truths that hide behind fame, you're in the right place. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because today, we're dissecting one of the most haunting questions in music history. Was Brian Wilson truly a free man? Or was he merely passed from one master to another? From a distance, Brian Wilson's life looks like a triumph. Grammy winner, Rock and Roll Hall of Famer, the architect of Pet Sound and album, even the Beatles credited as inspiration. But up close, it begins to resemble something else, a carefully orchestrated captivity, a slow erasure of self behind the curtain of applause. We know the headlines, but beneath the headlines is a pattern that repeats itself, not just in music, but in every arena where talent collides with control. A pattern where the very people who claim to protect the artist's family, doctors, managers, end up becoming their captors. And society, perhaps unwillingly, plays along. Brian Wilson's story forces us to ask, who really owns genius in America? The artist who creates it, or the system that profits from it? Before we dive in, let's be clear. This is not a scandal expose. This is a post-mortem on a phenomenon that still exists. The exploitation of fragile brilliance. And a warning that sometimes, when we clap the loudest, we're not celebrating a person, we're silencing them. So how did we get here? How did a California kid with perfect pitch and dreams of harmony become a man who feared the studio, feared the stage, and feared himself? How did the man who gave us good vibrations end up being told what to say, what to eat, and even what to think? And more disturbingly, how did so many people in his life, from his father to his psychiatrist, from his bandmates to his wife, gain so much control over his voice, his finances, and even his identity? These are the questions we'll be unpacking across the next few chapters of this story. And I promise you, the deeper we go, the less clear-cut the heroes and villains become. Because in this case, the villains didn't always wear black hats. Sometimes they wore lab coats. Sometimes family ties. Sometimes wedding rings. This is not a comfortable story. It's not meant to be. But it is necessary, because if it could happen to Brian Wilson, it can happen to any artist whose mind creates faster than it can cope. And perhaps it already is. Stay with us. What comes next will challenge everything you think you know about genius, and the price we're too often willing to let others pay for our entertainment. To understand the unraveling of Brian Wilson, we have to rewind back to the golden sunlit days of Southern California, where surfboards, convertibles, and AM radio hits painted a picture of carefree youth. But that picture was always a bit of an illusion. Even when the music sounded like joy, the man writing it was carrying an invisible weight that few around him seemed to recognize, or worse, chose to ignore. Brian's journey started like many stories of genius, though not with fame, but with isolation. From a young age, his hearing was impaired in one ear, a condition his father Murray allegedly caused through a violent blow. And that same father, a frustrated musician himself, quickly latched onto Brian's gifts not as something to nurture with love, but as a vessel through which he could relive his own failed ambitions. He pushed, he berated, and when necessary, he threatened. Murray wasn't just a stage parent. He was a tyrant disguised as a mentor. By age 12, Brian had already taught himself piano and could sing complex harmonies by ear. He wasn't just talented, he was obsessed. Music wasn't a hobby. It was a compulsion. He devoured records by the four freshmen, dissected vocal harmonies with surgical precision, and began guiding his younger brothers, Carl and Dennis, into the same musical vortex he inhabited. Even then, long before a recording contract, Brian Wilson was building something layer by layer, harmony by harmony. And yet, for all his brilliance, he was never at ease. School didn't offer relief. Brian clashed with his music teachers, refusing to follow theory rules because he believed he could hear something purer. He was punished for that independence, receiving an F in music. A bitter irony for someone who would one day redefine the genre. But it tells us something critical from early on. Brian was at war not just with external expectations, but with systems that couldn't understand how his mind worked. Systems that would later try to fix him when they should have listened. When the Beach Boys officially formed in 1961, originally under the name The Pendletons, it wasn't with grand ambition. The band was simply a way for a group of young relatives and friends to channel their energy. But once their first single, Surfin', caught the attention of record execs, and once the name was changed to the more marketable Beach Boys, everything accelerated. They weren't just musicians, they became icons of a California mythology that Brian was ironically too anxious to enjoy. Fame came fast. Too fast. By 1964, they were riding a wave of chart-topping singles and teenage hysteria. But inside Brian's head, that wave was already turning into a riptide. The pressure to produce was immense. Hits were expected constantly. He was writing, arranging, producing, and performing almost non-stop. And unlike his bandmates, Brian wasn't drawn to the stage lights. He preferred the studio, the layering of sounds, the slow art of creation. Performing in front of crowds only fed his anxiety, not his ego. The first public fracture came late that year. After marrying Marilyn Rovell, Brian suffered a total breakdown on a flight to Houston, crying uncontrollably, screaming into a pillow, collapsing into the aisle of the plane. His bandmates were stunned. The public never saw it, but for those closest to him, it was the first undeniable crack in the image. Brian didn't just need a break, needed help. That break was granted. He withdrew from touring with the band and stayed home to focus on writing and recording. On the surface, this seemed like a smart move. Behind the scenes, however, it marked the beginning of a much longer exile. What was intended as a short respite from the pressures of performance slowly morphed into a descent into isolation, instability, and eventually delusion. And yet this is where the paradox deepens. Out of that collapse came brilliance. It was during this period of reclusion and psychological fragility that Brian created some of his most innovative work, including the iconic album Pet Sounds. Using unorthodox instrumentation, layered harmonies, and a deep emotional resonance, Brian constructed a sonic world that was unlike anything the music industry had heard. It was his heart, mind, and confusion poured into vinyl. Pet Sounds was praised by critics and adored by musicians. But it didn't initially catch fire with mainstream American audiences. The commercial underperformance of his most personal work devastated Brian. It confirmed a fear that would haunt him for decades, that maybe the world didn't want his soul, just his surf songs. This disconnect between Brian's desire for emotional truth and the public's hunger for sunny nostalgia created a rift not just between artist and audience, but within Brian himself. One part of him wanted to explore the complex corners of human feeling. Another part knew that success, validation, and even love might only come if he stayed inside the box others had built for him. As his art evolved, his relationships began to fray. His father, Murray, frustrated by Brian's shifting priorities, sold the Beach Boys publishing rights allegedly without Brian's consent. It was a blow that crushed him. The rights to his own creations, his legacy, were traded for quick cash and control. For Brian, that betrayal by his own family was not just financial. It was spiritual. Something inside him began to break for good. And as we'll explore in the next chapter, that break didn't happen all at once. It came in waves through addiction, manipulation, and psychological exploitation that would last for decades. But here, at the edge of both his genius and his mental fragility, Brian Wilson stood as both a visionary and a warning. Because the deeper truth was beginning to emerge: you can have a mind that changes music forever and still be unprotected. You can be a legend and still be entirely alone. The deeper Brian Wilson retreated from the world, the more others stepped in to fill the vacuum, and not always with good intentions. It's often said that nature abhors a vacuum, but in show business, that vacuum doesn't just get filled, it gets monetized. By the early 1970s, Brian's mental health was no longer a secret among those around him. His behavior was unpredictable, erratic, and often deeply troubling. He painted his face green before meetings. He wandered the streets in a bathrobe. He sabotaged performances, distanced himself from friends, and lived in a fog of overindulgence and isolation. The man who once crafted pristine harmonies now lived in dissonance internally and externally. His diet, his substance use, and his psychological state spiraled downward. And the people who should have stepped in with compassion often responded with judgment or worse. Convenience. His wife, Marilyn, desperate for a solution, turned to Dr. Eugene Landy, a rising name in celebrity psychiatry. Landy had built a reputation as a man who could fix what others couldn't. But his methods were controversial, and his results often came with strings attached. What began as therapeutic intervention soon evolved into something else entirely. Under Landy's care, Brian was subjected to a 24-hour regimen. At first, the results seemed promising. He lost weight. His public behavior stabilized. He rejoined the Beach Boys for their album 15 Big Ones in 1976, and the media celebrated his apparent return from the brink. But behind the curtain, things were far from healed. Landy's approach wasn't just clinical, it was authoritarian. He isolated Brian from friends and family, took control of his diet, his medication, even his conversations. And as Brian's dependence deepened, so did Landy's reach. He positioned himself not just as a doctor, but as Brian's business partner, manager, and some might say puppet master. And here's where the story shifts from tragedy to something more insidious. Brian wasn't simply receiving treatment. He was being reshaped. His words were curated. His interviews were rehearsed. He was no longer just an artist. He was a performance in someone else's production. This was no longer therapy, it was control. By the late 1970s, Brian's family had grown concerned about Landy's influence and terminated his involvement. For a time, the Wilsons tried to manage Brian's care on their own, but without a strong system in place, and without the structure, even if toxic, that Landy had imposed. Brian unraveled again. He vanished for stretches, indulged in benders, and was found in increasingly disturbing states. One incident saw him wandering through Mexico, barefoot and without identification, playing piano in exchange for drinks at a bar. It was not a man living his life. It was a man barely surviving it. Then came the overdose. In 1982, Brian's body nearly gave out entirely. He was hospitalized. And it was clear he wouldn't make it unless something drastic changed. That moment, his near death became a turning point for his family. But instead of seeking new therapeutic models, they returned to the man they once feared, Eugene Landy. But this time, Landy had conditions. He demanded total control: financial, creative, legal, and the family agreed. They even helped orchestrate a plan to convince Brian he was broke, fired from the Beach Boys, and had no other choice. It was a con designed for his own good, or so they believed. What followed was a second era of Landy's dominance. Only now, it was more polished, more public, and far more profitable. Brian was back in the studio. He was giving interviews. He was smiling on cue. But every move was carefully stage managed. Landy surrounded him with handlers, filtered every relationship, and rebranded Brian Wilson not as an artist emerging from recovery but as a product packaged for consumption. And the world played along. Brian released his first solo album in 1988. It was critically acclaimed and commercially successful. On the surface, it seemed like a redemption story, but there were cracks in the narrative. Brian's own daughter would later accuse Landy of orchestrating every aspect of that comeback, claiming her father had little to no autonomy. Even more troubling, Landy inserted himself as a co-writer and co-producer, blurring the lines between therapy and exploitation. He wasn't just guiding Brian's recovery, he was profiting from it. When Brian released his autobiography in 1991, it too became a point of contention. Portions were allegedly ghostwritten using older material. Multiple family members, including his mother and bandmates, sued for defamation. They claimed the book misrepresented events, relationships, and history itself. Behind the curtain, many believed Landy had ghostwritten parts of the book himself, further muddying the waters between truth, therapy, and manipulation. Eventually, after mounting legal pressure and public scrutiny, the Wilson family was able to sever ties with Landy once and for all. A restraining order was filed. Landy was barred from contacting Brian again, and for a moment, it felt like justice. But the damage was already done. What happened during those years under Landy's control cannot be reduced to simple malpractice or manipulation. It was something more complex: a systemic failure to protect someone whose mind was too delicate for the weight of fame. A man with the soul of a composer, handed over again and again to people more interested in what he could produce than in how he was surviving. Brian's story during these years is not unique. Similar patterns echo across the entertainment world, where vulnerable minds are packaged, propped up, and paraded until they no longer serve their purpose, where the line between healing and handling is dangerously thin. In Landy, Brian found not a healer, but a keeper, and in the people who allowed it to happen, he found something even more tragic: silence. Because perhaps the cruelest part of his story isn't that he was manipulated, it's that so many knew and did nothing. When the restraining order was finally served against Eugene Landy, many hoped it marked the end of Brian Wilson's long descent into dependency and manipulation. But what it actually revealed was something far more painful. There was no clean break from what had already been broken. The influence may have been removed, but the scars it left ran deep and permanent. In the aftermath, Brian found himself drifting, once again caught between people who wanted to help and people who wanted to manage. Sometimes they were the same, and sometimes the difference was almost impossible to tell. Among those who stepped into the vacuum left by Landy's exit was Melinda Ledbetter, a car saleswoman who would become Brian's second wife and, for many years, his closest advocate. She's often credited with saving Brian from the grip of Landy's domination. She helped him reclaim legal independence. She reconnected him with family. She even became his manager, guiding his music career into a quieter but stable late-era resurgence. But as with so many parts of Brian's life, the story isn't black and white. For some, Melinda was a light in the darkness, a woman who saw the man behind the illness, who protected his dignity and fought for his voice. For others, she became a new kind of gatekeeper. Brian's daughter accused her of being overly controlling, dubbing her Melody, a painful echo of the man they had all worked so hard to remove. This was not a simple husband and wife relationship. It was a delicate balance of care, control, and creative direction. Melinda, by many accounts, made decisions on Brian's behalf, not always maliciously, but perhaps necessarily, because by then, Brian's mental state had been so weathered by years of trauma, medication, and emotional fatigue that full autonomy may never have been truly possible again. And this raises an uncomfortable but essential question. When does protection become possession? Brian's later years were marked by exactly this tension. He toured as a solo artist, something he had long feared, but fans and critics often speculated whether it was truly his decision. In interviews, he appeared disconnected or overly coached. At one point, when asked whether he enjoyed performing, Brian said no. Then, with almost eerie timing, a handler off-camera reminded him that he did, in fact, enjoy it. Brian quickly corrected himself. It was a moment that unsettled many. Was this a man finally enjoying his twilight years? Or was this just another chapter of soft-spoken captivity? Even his return to the Beach Boys in 2012 for their 50th anniversary tour came under scrutiny. He participated in studio recordings, appeared on stage, smiled for photos, but when asked in an interview whether he wanted to reunite with the band, his response was blunt. "I don't really like working with the guys, but it depends on how we feel and how much money is involved." That comment, while dismissed by some as a joke, revealed a deeper fatigue. The creative joy that once drove Brian had long since eroded under decades of obligation and emotional manipulation. For him, music no longer seemed like an act of expression. It sounded, increasingly, like a contract. And still, the music industry kept asking more. This is perhaps the cruelest paradox of Brian Wilson's legacy. The very system that consumed his youth kept pulling him back, encouraging the narrative of a reborn artist, while ignoring the quiet truth that the artist never really came back. Instead, what the public got was a carefully curated version of Brian smiling when asked, performing when scheduled, showing up when needed, a man reassembled, but never quite whole. Meanwhile, the fractures within his family, both professional and personal, continued to deepen. His memoir, Wouldn't It Be Nice? My Own Story, had already caused a storm years earlier, co-written during Landy's reign. It was revealed to contain inaccuracies, omissions, and passages lifted from other books. Lawsuits followed. His mother, his cousins, even longtime bandmates filed for defamation. They claimed the book misrepresented relationships and events in a way that only served Landy's narrative. So even Brian's own story, his voice on paper, was in question. That's the tragedy that lingers the longest. Brian Wilson wasn't just manipulated in life. His legacy, his words, and his history were all filtered through the hands of others. Some acted out of love, others out of self-interest. Most probably thought they were doing the right thing. But the result was the same. Brian was often the last person consulted about Brian. What's left behind is a legacy wrapped in contradictions. A man known for making us feel joy, who often lived in despair. A performer celebrated by millions, who spent much of his life retreating from the spotlight. A musical revolutionary, whose rights to his own songs were sold out from under him. A father, a husband, a friend, and yet so frequently alone. The closer we look, the more we see a disturbing pattern that stretches beyond just Brian Wilson. It's about how society romanticizes broken geniuses, how we prop up the myth of troubled brilliance without questioning what or who made them troubled in the first place. We excuse erratic behavior as part of the artist's temperament. We overlook cries for help because the product still sounds good. We treat their suffering as backstory, when it's often the entire story. In Brian's case, the suffering was baked into the music. Those harmonies, so lush, so layered, weren't just studio wizardry. They were emotional armor. Every note was a coping mechanism, every arrangement a cry for structure in a life defined by chaos. And even today, when we stream his music or see clips of him on stage, we have to ask, what are we really applauding? The man? The myth? Or the machine that pushed him forward long after he wanted to stop? Because in the end, Brian Wilson gave the world everything it asked for. And the world, knowingly or not, kept asking until there was almost nothing left. The more we peel back the layers of Brian Wilson's story, the more it becomes impossible to ignore a disturbing truth. He wasn't only failed by those closest to him, he was failed by all of us. It's easy to point fingers at managers, doctors, or family members, but the audience, the public, the fans played their part too. And that role is far more complex than we often care to admit. In the decades since Brian's initial breakdown, his story has become a kind of cultural shorthand. The tortured genius, a phrase we hear so often it no longer stings. But that label, romantic as it may sound in books or documentaries, acts as a kind of shield, allowing us to enjoy the music while distancing ourselves from the suffering behind it. The media leaned into that narrative hard. Every article about Brian was tinged with phrases like mad genius, eccentric genius, or fragile genius, as if his mental illness was a feature, not a crisis, as if the hallucinations and breakdowns were creative quirks. Instead of warning signs, we saw him as unpredictable, mysterious, enigmatic, because that made him fascinating. Because that sold records. Because that fed into the myth. And let's be honest, myths are easier to digest than messy realities. The reality was far less poetic. It involved screaming fits in public, disassociation in the middle of interviews, withdrawal from his children, fear of the telephone, voices in his head that whispered threats and lies. None of that was cinematic. None of it looked like Hollywood genius. It looked like what it was: mental illness, long-standing, untreated, and tragically misunderstood. But pop culture doesn't reward that kind of honesty. So instead, we package Brian's pain into something beautiful. We bought the reissues. We streamed the tours. We posted tributes. And in doing so, we unwittingly kept the machinery turning. There's an ugly contradiction at the heart of entertainment culture. We claim to love artists for their vulnerability, but we rarely allow them to actually be vulnerable. We want the heartbreak in their lyrics, but not in their lives. We'll listen to their cries for help as long as it's set to a good beat. Brian Wilson's life is a case study in how entertainment industries, and by extension, their audiences, and consume a person. And the cruelest part? They often do it in the name of love. Take his final performances. Fans describe watching him on stage in recent years as both awe-inspiring and deeply uncomfortable. Brian would sit rigidly at the piano, expressionless, barely reacting. His voice, once youthful and buoyant, now cracked and distant. And still, the crowd cheered. Some wept. Many said it felt like closure. But closure for who? Was it for Brian, who reportedly didn't even want to tour? Or was it for the fans, who wanted one last chance to touch the myth before it disappeared? This is where the conversation gets thorny because it forces us to ask what we, as a society, are really doing when we revere suffering. Are we honoring the artist? Or are we feeding off their pain? Are we witnesses? Or are we complicit? And it's not just Brian. The cycle repeats. Again and again. Amy Winehouse, Whitney Houston, Kurt Cobain, Britney Spears, each with their own version of Brian's story. Talented, vulnerable, overwhelmed and pushed back on stage. Back into the studio. Back into the spotlight. Always for the fans. And yes, fans can be supportive, loyal, even life-saving. But they can also become the final pressure that breaks someone. Because when your entire self-worth is tethered to the applause of millions, how do you walk away? How do you say no? Brian Wilson may have been surrounded by handlers and contracts, but make no mistake, he was also surrounded by expectation, by people who meant well, by people who loved the music, by people like us. It's time we ask ourselves what role we really play in the lives of artists we claim to adore. Do we support their healing? Or only their productivity? Do we cheer their boundaries? Or only their comebacks? Because in Brian's case, the lines blurred. Even when he was clearly unwell, the demand never stopped. More music, more interviews, more tours. And every time he delivered, we applauded. But at what cost? Behind the applause, there was a man who once dug a grave in his backyard, who once ran barefoot across the border, broken and lost, who once screamed on an airplane while everyone pretended not to see. That man was still there, even when the lights came back on. So when we talk about the tragedy of Brian Wilson, we can't stop at blaming individuals. We have to look in the mirror. We have to ask hard questions about what we reward, what we ignore, and what we romanticize. Because the system that failed him is still alive. It's still selling albums, still booking tours, still framing pain as part of the brand. And perhaps the most painful truth of all, that system doesn't need to abuse someone to exploit them. All it needs to do is keep asking for more. The final act of Brian Wilson's story didn't unfold on a stage or in a studio. It happened in silence, a slow fade rather than a curtain drop. And when news broke in June 2025 that Brian had passed away at age 82, it didn't feel like the end of a life fight, felt like the end of a haunting performance that never truly stopped. But even in death, the questions don't go away. We often ask what someone like Brian Wilson leaves behind. The music. Yes, the innovation, the influence. But what about the intangible things? The confusion? The misrepresentation? The myth built on top of a mind that never found peace? What does it mean to outlive your own agency? To have your name turned into an idea you no longer control? In the months leading up to his death, Brian's public appearances had become increasingly rare and disquieting. He was diagnosed with dementia. His beloved wife and advocate, Melinda, had died just months earlier. And while many tributes framed his passing as the conclusion of a long, brilliant journey, the truth was far less tidy. This wasn't a man who got to retire peacefully, knowing his story had been told fairly and fully. It was a man whose identity had been edited so many times that even he seemed unsure of what parts were real anymore. Brian once said the voices in his head was constant. Dissonant whispers were both tormentors and muses. He called them his heroes and villains. It's a poetic line, one that fans have clung to, but it also reveals a deep fracture in his view of the world. Because for Brian, inspiration and destruction often came from the same source. Sometimes that source was his father, who taught him to harmonize and taught him fear. Sometimes it was a therapist, who offered him stability and total submission. Sometimes it was a fan base, who gave him adoration and a burden he couldn't shake. It's easy to paint Brian Wilson as a singular figure, But the forces that shaped him used him, praised him, sold him are not unique. They are systemic. They are cultural. And they are still operating today in a society that commodifies everything. Even human emotion becomes currency. Vulnerability is rebranded as raw content. Trauma is packaged into biopics and books. And if someone is lucky enough to survive the machine, they're often left with nothing but fragments of memory, of self, of truth. That's the part we don't like to talk about. The part where we realize that success doesn't equal safety, that genius doesn't come with a shield, and that even the most iconic voices can be silenced long before death arrives. So what do we do with this story? We could, of course, celebrate the music. And we should. Brian Wilson reshaped the sonic vocabulary of modern music. He broke rules that didn't serve him. He chased beauty that others couldn't hear. His legacy as a composer is unquestionable. The melodies he created will outlive all of us. But if that's all we take from his life, we've missed the point entirely. Because the greater lesson isn't just in what Brian did, it's in what he endured. It's in how a man so gifted could be so vulnerable, so exposed, so constantly handed off between those who claimed to know what was best for him. It's in how easily care becomes control when no one is watching closely. It's in how quickly a story of brilliance can turn into one of quiet erasure. In the end, Brian Wilson didn't just leave behind songs. He left behind a mirror, one that reflects not only the music industry's cold efficiency, but our own tendency to blur the line between admiration and expectation, between support and suffocation. We love our artists when they're broken just enough to be interesting, but not so broken that they stop producing. And so the question lingers. Long after the final chord fades, if someone like Brian Wilson, beloved, respected, immortalized Calum, finds safety or autonomy in a world that celebrated him, what does that say about the rest of us? How many other stories are unfolding right now? Just out of view? How many other minds are being shaped by pressure instead of passion? Management instead of meaning? How long before we learn that talent without protection is a tragedy waiting to happen? Because genius, for all its glow, is still human, still fragile, still breakable, and sometimes the most brilliant minds are the easiest to lose, not because they burn out, but because we never gave them room to breathe. That is the real legacy of Brian Wilson, and it's one we ignore at our own peril. So maybe the real tragedy isn't just that Brian Wilson suffered. Maybe it's that we still don't know how to recognize when someone like him is suffering until it's far too late. Maybe we've built a world where beauty is expected to come from brokenness, and we cheer it on, right up until the moment that brokenness can no longer hold. We remember his music because it made us feel alive. But how often did we stop to ask what it cost him to give it to us? And if this is what happened to someone with global recognition, wealth, and a legacy of artistic genius, what does that mean for the countless others who fall through the cracks with no spotlight to catch their fall? How many more brilliant minds will be managed instead of understood? How many more will be remembered for what they created, but forgotten for what they endured? That's not a question with a simple answer, but it's one we can't afford to keep avoiding. Because in the end, maybe genius was never meant to be consumed. Maybe it was meant to be protected. Thank you for staying with us through the full story. If this made you think differently about fame, about art, about the cost of brilliance, then help us uncover more stories that need to be told. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any truth that's been buried or any genius the world tried to silence. We'll see you in the next one.